So here we are, ladies and gentlemen, back, or at least on our way back, from our Around the World tour. How do you summarize something like that? Well, as I said in Paths of Return, the answer is that you can't, or not at least in any detail. My task, as I see it at least, in this my final YouTube presentation, is simply to cast a quick glance back down the road we've traveled, looking in our mental rearview mirror to remind ourselves of just a few highlights of our journey. Call this whatever you want, a summary, a recap, a brief synopsis, an overview. Whatever you call it, what we're looking to do is to recall some overall patterns. This isn't going to be like one of those travel books you can buy that tell you about every hotel in the country you're visiting, with room rates and dinner menus and all the nearby attractions. It's more like some brief entries in a diary or a journal that you kept as you traveled. Or actually, probably better, it's like a collection of postcards you'd send home to your family or friends. How much can you get on a postcard anyway? Now, of course, since our tour has been a tour of religions and not of art museums or castles or, famous rivers, maybe the homes of great playwrights, this look back can't help but also include a look forward. For the whole point of a religion is not just to explain who we are and how we got here, but also to prepare us for what lies ahead. Anyway, here we go with some highlights. As usual, I'll go over some things I've already said in the lecture you read, but with some additional remarks and suggestions and provocations. So first, the approach in review. We've been attempting, as you know, to look along the religions we're studying, and not simply to look at them. We've attempted to step into the sunbeam in C.S. Lewis's Meditation in a Tool Shed, and to look along it so as to gaze at the sun itself, rather than to stand to one side simply looking at people who themselves are gazing at their suns. In other words, we've tried to step into the shoes of the religious people we're studying, so as to see what things look like from a Hindu, a Buddhist, a Taoist, a Confucian, a Jewish, a Muslim, and a Native American perspective. The approach has also been, as you know, philosophical and theological. In other words, we've tried to address the big questions. Who's God? What's God? How did we get here? How did the world get created? What is the status, as it were, in reality of that world? How does time work? What is time? What does it mean to live after death? What is the future life? What is a human being? What does it mean to flourish as a human being? What is the ideal human state? These have been the kinds of questions we've looked at primarily, rather than sociological, psychological, historical issues. The approach has been positive, and by that I simply mean here to say we have not accentuated, certainly not stressed the downside, the negativity of religion, religion's role in war and in violence and so forth, albeit there is such a place, there is such a side to religion, we know that. We've stressed the positive. In Paths of Return, I said it's been sort of a religion appreciation course that you've undertaken with me. The approach has also been supra-scientific and supernaturalist. We've accentuated how it is that the traditions believe, at least, claim that one can know things beyond what we see, hear, taste, touch, and smell with our natural senses. It's been supernaturalist in character, inasmuch as we allow for, we underscore, we stress, we accept, we believe with the religious people we're studying that there is something beyond the whole natural world, higher levels of reality. And then, of course, the approach has also been perennialist. More about that in a moment. But I wanted to also quote again, as I did in Paths of Return, this line from C.S. Lewis, and apply it now to your instructor, myself, and say, as he said, well, even if you don't believe all this stuff I've been telling you, maybe at the very least I can be useful as a kind of specimen. So I say with Lewis here, use your specimens while you can. There may not be many more people who take the religions quite so seriously. But then back to perennialism. What's the perennialist? Again, a reminder, review here. The perennialist is somebody who tries to follow, well, what I say here in red, a via media. That's Latin for a middle way. Tries to go down the center between extremes. Tries to balance, as it were, between two different extremes of opinion or approach or perspective. On the one hand, on the left, indiscriminate exclusivism. The indiscriminate exclusivist is the person who says only one religion is true, right? Only one religion is valid. My religion is valid, but everybody else is in big trouble. Everybody else's path is leading in the wrong direction toward, well, if not toward hell, then toward meaninglessness. And the other extreme that the perennialist is trying to balance, on the right-hand side, indiscriminate inclusivism, which is anything goes-ism. Believe whatever you want. It's just fine, different strokes for different folks. Everybody's religion is as valid as anybody else's religion. Well, that's not what the perennialist is saying. The perennialist is also going to discriminate between what he or she regards as true, as valid traditions, and things that are simply circling, as it were, the base of the mountain or going off toward the desert, rather than allowing the person who follows them to ascend to the summit, to ascend toward God. The perennialist likes to stress, as we've said several times, certain inward or esoteric commonalities between the traditions, in particular, their common interest in truth, in virtue, in beauty, and in prayer. While at the same time, the perennialist is certainly not wanting to sweep under the rug the big differences between the traditions on their outsides. Their different conceptions exoterically of God, their different understandings of who should be in charge, authority figures, their different views of time and the world. Exemplary states means the ideal human state, the goal of human beings. They're differently worded for sure, different pictures of the human self for sure. So let's review some of those outward differences first here. Again, you've seen this slide before, right? I used this early on in the course. So the religions, the perennialist says, are like different dialectical variations on a common language, the upper left box. Coming down below that, the religions are like different radii pointing toward a common center, or like different bands in the spectrum of light that are all part of one rainbow. Or again, upper right corner, like the common organs we all have on our insides, however differently we might look on the outside. Well, the perennialist says, yeah, commonalities for sure, but there certainly are different fingers on that hand, different radii in that circle. The bands of the spectrum are not all the same in their frequency, and we certainly do look different on the outside, different genders, different body types, different races, different colors of skin, and so forth. The perennialist does not want to neglect those differences. The perennialist, at least this perennialist, at least your instructor here, yours truly, is a perennialist in part, has perennialist convictions, or at least perennialist tendencies, because of the fact that I see in these traditions saintly figures, people regarded by the different traditions as representative of what they're seeking to acquire, the kind of state that they're seeking to reach in their saints. They all have people, at least in my opinion, that are very impressive, that I myself look to and say, yeah, you really ought to be more like that yourself. People that I want to emulate. People that have gone, and I'll remind you here also of something we've said before, beyond belief and beyond faith and beyond simply contact with something spiritual, something divine, experience. They've actually been in some way transformed by that contact, transformed by their relation to God, by whatever name they refer to God. I quoted in the lecture you read, Paths to Return, the passage that also appears on the syllabus, namely, you will know them by their fruits. And I quote the whole passage here from Jesus' comments in the Sermon on the Mount, recorded in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 7, where he warns of being aware of false prophets. He warns against false prophets. Then he says, you will know them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorns or figs from thistles? And then a sound tree cannot bear evil fruit. A bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Well, if the tree in question, metaphorically speaking, is a religious tradition, a spiritual path, and if you find good fruit, if you find people like some of the people we've looked at, a Swami Ramdas or a Soko Moranaga or the Sheikh Alalawi or Thomas Yellowtail, and if you look at their lives and you go, yeah, that's pretty profoundly, attractive, something that I want to emulate in there. If there's a good fruit, then that seems to me to imply it's a sound tree or a good tree that fruit has grown on. And then, of course, Christ adds, it's not everybody who just says to me, Lord, Lord. Not everybody who speaks to me as Lord, addresses me as Lord, or prays to me as Lord. In other words, not simply Christians who call Jesus Lord. It's not simply those people who, quote, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. And I'm implying here, suggesting here, asking you maybe to consider the fact in this context that we have people in other traditions, in other religions, who are in fact living up to the, quote, will of the Father, even though they may not be Christians. I quoted also this line from an early Christian church father, early saint, Gregory of Nyssa, 4th century. He says, there's no other way truly to speak about God than to live in him. He alone knows God, who allows himself to be transmuted into God. And that, what he calls transmutation into God, is what I've been calling throughout the whole course transformation. Again, the highest state possible, a state reached by, or at least closely approached by, some of the saints that we've talked about. All right, but again, we need to be aware of the differences. I'm not trying to, pretend they're not there. They are there. We've looked, as you know, along the sunbeam, standing in the position occupied by religious people in 4 different categories, 4 different families. People in South Asia, East Asia, the West, and then also most recently the primal family of religious people. So using the numbers here, 1, 2, 3, 4, the 4 different groups that we've looked at successively, let's just review some of the differences here quickly. And I've got some pictures. Pictures are worth 1,000 words, that they say, right? So first of all, category 1 in South Asia, when it comes to God, conceptions of God, we've seen a couple of things. We've seen, now I'm calling this 1A, so 1 is South Asia again, right? We've seen that the tradition of Hinduism is, at least exoterically, polytheistic. And so I've got my many little stars here dancing, as it were, on the surface of the earth to represent polytheism. Many different gods and goddesses, 330 million, as I recall, at least on the outside. But we also said, we stressed this, that inwardly, esoterically, down, 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 deep beneath all the 330 million, right? Hindus are monists. They actually say ultimately all of these are simply the various powers of Brahman. So still South Asia, 1, but now B, the other side of the coin, monism, here being represented by my big, big star, taking up the whole box because Brahman is the only thing that exists. Well, we contrasted that, right, with East Asia, now 2, where again we see a couple of different perspectives. This image is meant to represent Buddhism. So the Buddhist is the A-theist, right? The Buddha said he's not going to answer questions about whether there is a God or not. So we simply have a blank sky. I remember, do you remember this line from the video, the Long Search series video on Japan, Japanese Buddhism? And the narrator, Ronald Eyre, is in a Zen monastery interviewing a Zen abbot. And the narrator, Ronald Eyre, looks around and he says, I haven't seen any pictures in your little center here, in your spiritual community, as I do see pictures, images of the gods and goddesses in other centers of religion, worship in other religions. What's going on here? Do you remember the abbot's reply? He said, "There is Buddha for those who do not know what Buddha is. There is no Buddha for those who know what Buddha is." A pretty koan type answer, I guess. But notice, there is no Buddha. There is no divine. The sky is empty. For those who know what the divine is, there's nothing in the sky. That's Buddhism in East Asia. So 2A, Buddhism, and then 2B, I'm suggesting going back again to the Taoist tradition of China, also East Asia, which we described as panentheistic. So somehow everything is contained here, right, within God. My green, which represents the world, is inside of the star, which is the Tao. Everything is somehow contained within Tao in the Taoist tradition. So that's the other side, 2B of East Asia. Well, 3, the West, we can represent that a lot more simply. There's my one star, monotheism. No other stars in the sky. There's just one God for the Muslim and the Christian and the Jew. And that star is radiating down toward the world because it's showing its relation to creatures, its care of creatures, its compassion, and so on. That's monotheism. And then finally, 4, we've said that the primal traditions, including the Native Americans, are perhaps best described as animistic. Now the divine, the star, is inside of the world, ensouling, animating it from the inside out. So we've talked about, we've reflected on, we need to admit, even us perennialists have to admit, very different pictures of God, at least on the outside. And then there are different authority figures. There is in South Asia, again, number 1 here, the guru, the guide, the person who's already experienced moksha, and who can lead us as his spiritual followers into that experience ourselves. In East Asia, now I've not used this term philosopher king before. We did talk about, and number 2 here is primarily in relation to Confucianism. So East Asia, number 2, the tradition of Confucianism, where remember the ruler is at the head of that whole social hierarchy, the 5 constant relationships, rulers and subjects and husbands and wives and parents and kids and so on. The ruler was way up at the top. And right, Confucius said the ruler himself needs to be subject to, in submission to, showing li and respect towards something higher, which is the mandate of heaven. So that's the top authority in this system. Well, I'm comparing it here, one last comparison maybe, with Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher Plato that we've quoted before from his Republic, where he says, and I quote him here under the asterisk, "Unless either philosophers become kings, or those who are now called kings and rulers come to be sufficiently inspired with a genuine desire for wisdom, unless, that is to say, political power and philosophy meet together, there can be no rest from troubles." Well, what I'm trying to say here is that in East Asia, it's the wedding, the conjunction of political power, political authority, and what Plato calls philosophical authority, but spiritual authority too. It's when those come together that you have the most important authority figure in the culture. He calls it the philosopher king, and Confucius then calls it the ruler. Again, now West, 3, simpler. It's the prophet. It's the figure of Muhammad in particular for Muslims in general, but then any prophetic figure is meant to be the authority figure for that religion. And then finally, 4, primal peoples. We've talked about this the most recently, the shaman, right? The medicine man is the key spiritual authority for a primal religious person. Well, understandings of time. I don't know how to visualize all of these. I'm just sort of playing a bit here, speculating a little bit. South Asia, Hinduism, reincarnation. Remember all about, we talked about the time, the yugas, and how the different yugas repeat and come back again, Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, to use the Western terminology. The billions, the trillions of years that time has lasted. So in a sense, it's going forward. It's lasted a long, long, long time, but there's also circularity in it. So you combine length, linearity, and circularity. What do you get? You get a spiral. So this is my mnemonic visual device for myself, at least in thinking about the Hindu, South Asian understanding of time. Well, I don't know what to say. East Asia, Taoism. The Tao certainly doesn't really talk about time. Time is just sort of, I don't know. It's in the background. It's not at all emphasized. So I just put a little dot here for my East Asian time. Maybe you could come up with a better image yourself. The West is easy. Jews, Christians, Muslims, time's linear, right? There's a beginning. God created the world, and it's going bum, 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 bum down the tracks toward a destiny which God himself has in mind. He's guiding it towards some sort of fulfillment. When Christians and Muslims, at least, would say Christ returns, and when Jews would say the Messiah finally shows up, well, that's the end of history. And then again, most recently, category 4, primal religions. You can see what I'm trying to say here, I hope, with my image, namely the cycle of the seasons. So we've got summer and we've got spring and summer and then fall and then winter circling round. Everything goes round and round and round in these primal traditions, right? Circularity. Views of the world. And again, I'm kind of playing around here a little bit. What is the world? Well, the Hindu would say it's Maya. It's illusion. It's in some way bending, distorting what's really there as we look. The world is sort of like the water in a glass of water, and the refracted rays of light on that water make it look like that pencil is bent, although it's not really bent. Remember, we talked about Maya, illusion, in South Asia. East Asia, again, I'm probably having the hardest time here, especially with Taoism. What is the world? Well, I'm picturing the world from a Taoist perspective as a kind of reflection. It's a mirror image, as it were, of something higher, of the Tao itself. And I have in mind here the yin and the yang, and how everything in the cosmos is an interplay of those complementary but opposite forces, in some way embodying, reflecting, expressing, mirroring the Tao itself. So that's my picture, at least, of the world from the Taoist, the East Asian, number 2 perspective. Number 3, again, a little bit easier, I think, at least, creation. The world is created. The world is an artifact. It's a product. It's an effect of a wise creator and ruler of that world, namely God. And what I've done here is pulled in for a close-up shot of that image I showed you from the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, where God is creating Adam by touching his finger. So creation is the Western perspective, number 3. And then 4, again, I don't know, how do you do this exactly? Condensation. What is condensation? Well, condensation, right, is where steam, that is to say, water in a gaseous state, meets a cool or a colder surface, a piece of metal or the window, and turns into water. It condenses. Now, steam and liquid water are both H2O. So is ice. It's also H2O in a frozen state. So all of these are different states of the same basic substance. So what I'm trying to say here, I guess, with that image is that the world, in a sense, the physical world, the world of all the animals, all the creatures of nature and so forth, are, for the primal person, like the Native American, in a state of solidity, but they're related, right? They're continuously related, as it were, to their archetype, their spiritual pattern, the spirit form of the coyote or the spirit form of the buffalo. So that's what I'm trying to image here with this notion of the world in general, nature in general, is a kind of condensed condensation version of a spiritual world that's right there very closely behind it and intimately, organically linked to it. What are the exemplary states? By exemplary states, I simply mean, what is it that we ought all to be aspiring to reach as religious people? Well, South Asia says it's enlightenment. Well, enlightenment, you could also say moksha, liberation for Hindus. I'm picking up on the Buddhist idea. Buddhism also originated, right, in South Asia, of nirvana or enlightenment. In East Asia, now you see what I'm thinking of here mainly is Confucianism. The Confucian ideal is to reach a state of compassion for all living beings. The idea of compassion is typical, characteristic of the Confucian tradition of empathy, reaching single-heartedness, common-heartedness with all other beings. That's what we should be aspiring to. In the West, here I'm just focusing on Islam for the moment, it's peace. It is Islam, which is also translated, as you know, as submission. The exemplary state is to be humbly submissive to Allah, to God, and that will result in your reaching a state of true peace. And then finally, fourthly, primal religions, Native Americans included, participation. We talked about that at some length. A participatory, consciously participatory relationship with everything around you, as for example, the shaman has, the medicine man has, who can exploit and can use that relationship with things for the benefit of his people in healing and so on. I'm going to have now some pictures of what the human self, the real self, really is from these four different religious perspectives. Number one, again, South Asia. What am I trying to image here? Well, the bigger yellow stick figure, that's who you and I think we are. That's the self that we misidentify with. That's us as tigers thinking we're just baby goats. But of course, the real self, the true self, the capital S self, the red stick figure, well, that's something down deep inside of us that we don't ordinarily contact. That's the Atman. And the Atman is Brahman, Tattvam Asi. You are the ultimate reality. But you need to re-identify yourself from yellow to red to access that. Well, that's what I'm trying to say here in summarizing a picture of the human self in South Asia, among Hindus in particular. 2, East Asia. Well, again, this is the Confucian picture primarily. Remember, East Asia, interested in who's my neighbor? Who are you as my complementary part? And the self, the true self, for the Confucian in particular, comes about, right, when two people, those are my two yellow figures, as it were, join hands. And at the point of juncture, we've now got red, and that red little dot in the middle, that's where the true self resides, in union. In complementary union, maybe a Taoist would say, but certainly in a union that's consistent with the 5 constant relationships in the Confucian tradition. That's where we become really ourselves in community. In the West, well, all I'm saying here, I think, is that kind of like what you see is what you get. For a Jew and for a Christian and for a Muslim, it's a little bit simpler. You, as you understand yourself now, body, soul, spirit, the whole 9 yards, as we say, that's the self. That was the self that was created by God in his image and likeness. And that's what you need to cultivate. That's what needs to be transformed. That's what needs to be obedient to God, as a Muslim would say, to follow the Torah, the law, as a Jew might say. That's the self that Christ came to save, a Christian might say, but that's who you are right there. That thing on the screen is you. Well, now, last, primal people, 4. How do you picture that? Well, I talked about participation again, especially the shamanic appropriation of participation, the shaman's way of using participation by exiting the body, right, in ecstatic experience, and being able to swim, as it were, along channels outside himself. Well, I'm trying to get at that, remind you of that with this figure now with a permeated, a permeable exterior. The self is not confined to the body. The self is not just what's inside of your skin. The self is somehow related to everything around it, if only you realize that. That's what the primal people are trying to say. Again, a different perspective for sure. So, different perspectives, exoterically, outwardly, certainly, different pictures of many different sorts of things. And the perennialist, let's come back to that person again, that perspective again, is not trying to ignore that. The perennialist says, yeah, immanently, down here on our level right now, in what Frithjof Schuon, I quoted him in the reading, called the human atmosphere, there is certainly diversity. Indeed, on the outside, there's contradiction. We're not pretending it's not there. No, the perennialist is saying, if you go up our mountain, ascend, go up toward what Schuon calls the divine stratosphere, that's where, if anywhere, you're going to find unity among the religions. It's a transcendent, not an immanent unity. Again, immanently, diversity, transcendently, unity. That's where the perennialist finds these commonalities of truth and virtue and beauty and prayer. All right, well, I posed the question in Paths of Return, in what you read. You didn't know it, I don't think, at the time, but I was actually quoting myself, which is probably not such a good thing to do. But I quoted a passage from a book of mine called Advice to the Serious Seeker, and the question was almost the same, I think, in the reading. Perhaps you're prepared to accept the idea. Maybe yes, maybe no, but let's say that you are for the sake of the argument. You're prepared to accept the idea that there may be more than one saving religion. And yet, you may still be wondering, so why? Who cares? What's to be gained from that? If the unity of the great religions is to be realized only at a level where it will no longer be an issue, in other words, at a transcendent level where we're all up the mountain, and the Hindu and the Muslim and the Jew and the Confucian go, wow, you're here too? Fantastic. I didn't realize that your path was going to lead up here also. If you're no longer at a place that it's of issue now, what exactly is the point of proclaiming that unity right now, down here in the human atmosphere? Especially if proclaiming the unity risks being confused by some people with relativism, which is anything goesism, syncretism, which is take a little bit of this and a little bit of that and make up your own religion. And sometimes people say perennialists sound like relativists or they sound like syncretists, even though they're not that. So why talk about that? Why do I talk about that? If you can, risk these kinds of confusions and so forth. Why does one do that? Well, my answer was, as you know, and I'm reviewing this now with you too, my answer in what you read was to say, we need to be aware. I think we need to be aware. The signs of the times are telling us, it seems to me, that we need to be aware. There are shifting religious alliances going on in our day and age. In the past, on the left, certainly, the different religions were more, I think, opposed to each other, and perhaps rightly so. So Hindus versus Muslims, Christians versus Jews, etc. Now, by opposed, I don't mean they were fighting or trying to hurt each other or kill each other or something like that, but the boundaries were more strictly observed, perhaps, in the past by large numbers of people. You're a Hindu, you're a Muslim, you're a Christian, you're a Jew, you're a Confucian. Let's keep those boundaries intact. Well, parenthesis, except in East Asia, where the Buddhists and the Confucians and Taoists did get along more and people were practicing more than one religion. But certainly among the Western religions, South Asia, you've got these kind of boundaries in the past that were strongly maintained. But I'm saying on the right-hand side, in present times, what I'm seeing, at least myself, is that traditionalist people who are trying to maintain their own religious traditions and to treat them seriously and sincerely and to practice them fully and faithfully, as Hindus and as Muslims and as Christians and as Jews and so forth, those traditionalist people, I think, are finding themselves closer in some ways to each other, even across religious boundaries, than those same people are to people, nominally at least, in their own religions, who are starting to compromise. I call them here modernists and postmodernists. So a modernist Christian, it seems to me, is further apart from a traditionalist Christian than is that traditionalist Christian apart from a traditionalist Hindu or Buddhist. Now, I'm simply saying this. I'm laying this out here for you to reflect on, ponder as you go forward in life. I can't prove this right now, but that's my sense. And that's part of my own reason for being interested in and attracted to the perennialist point of view. Because the perennialist says, yeah, well, there are these ultimate unities. And so right now, even now while we're divided and see all these exoteric differences, we can still maybe unite and have an alliance that would be good for all of our spiritual lives. There are, as I see it, three grounds for, I'm calling it here, traditionalist concord. Alliance across religious boundaries between people who are taking their own religion seriously, trying to follow them faithfully. And I talked about this in Paths of Return, of course. The three grounds are the reality of miracles, primacy of truth, consecration of life. First of all, reality of miracles. And I put magic in parentheses here to remind you that at least among primal peoples, maybe the dividing line between those two words is a little bit blurred. Miracles and magic kind of go together maybe there. What do I mean? Well, what do I have in mind? I have in mind, when I talk about that, the claims of Native Americans and primal people in general to ecstatic powers concerning the ecstatic power of the shaman to exit the physical body. Well, obviously, from a modern, scientific, materialist, this world is the only world point of view, that's impossible. That's something that simply undercuts the assumptions of modern people about how the world works, if there really are people who can engage in out-of-the-body travel. That would be a miraculous thing. For the Jew, it's a miracle like the parting of the Red Sea, which we've talked about. For a Muslim, it's Muhammad's mirage. Remember that? Where he's taken up miraculously, up to the throne of Allah. Having traveled instantaneously from Mecca to Jerusalem, he then goes up vertically to the throne of Allah. Well, you can't do that. Well, you can inside of these religious traditions. They all have a sense that miracles and magic are possible. Or maybe a sillier example, the Zen master archer splitting the first arrow that he shot right smack into the bullseye center in the dark with a second arrow. Now, how do you do that? Isn't that something that's also, well, at least abnormal, if not miraculous? So again, a kind of sense of something outside of the ordinary boundaries in Zen Buddhism. Or take these different figures we've talked about. The Jivan Mukta, who achieves liberation in this life. Somebody like Sri Ramana Maharshi, who my friend Rama Kumaraswamy told me completely rejected any kind of anesthetic while he was having the surgery and seemed to be totally detached from the extraordinary pain in his body. Is that a miracle? Is that something it's certainly out of the ordinary. The hidden Imam, or the Taoist immortal in first Shia Islam and secondly in Taoism. These beings, these people, these human beings who apparently have lived for centuries and centuries and centuries. How do you do that? That's out of the ordinary. I quote again Christ here, with men, all of this stuff is impossible. Impossible from the point of view of natural science and natural law and so on. But with God, all things are possible. All of the religions we've studied would be unanimous, in spite of their outside differences, in thinking, believing that, all kinds of supernatural things are possible in view of the divine. This means that traditionalist Hindus and Buddhists and Confucians and Taoists and Muslims and Jews and Native Americans and Christians are united in as much as they have a kind of common opponent in materialists. A materialist simply says matter, stuff you can weigh and graph and count, take into your laboratory, that's the only stuff that exists. And all the religions say, no, you're blind. You've closed your mind to all of these extraordinary possibilities. The common opponent we could also call the demythologizer. Demythologizing is a term that actually came out of 20th century biblical criticism on the part of New Testament scholars who had bought in basically to the modern perspective and who dismissed miracles as simply pre-scientific silliness, and who wanted to read the Gospels by stripping away all of the miraculous things that Christ is said to have done and just retain his comments on virtue and good life and moral behavior and so on. So the common opponent, again, of the traditions would be demythologization as well as materialism. So here's an example of what I mean by alliance or concord across religious boundaries. Second example, I've called it the primacy of truth. Whether you're a Hindu, traditionalist Hindu at least, traditionalist Buddhist, Muslim, Confucian, Jew, whatever it is, you believe that truth is absolute. There are certain things, certain spiritual truths that do not change, and they have their reverberation, those truths in this world, in terms of certain kinds of behavior, certain kinds of lifestyles that also ought not to change, that should be permanent. And you take that primacy of truth and you say, I'm willing to fight for that. I'm willing to defend that. I don't think we ought to be bending and changing the truth with a capital T. Well, in that light, I'm recalling here for you Krishna's advice, Krishna, the incarnate avatar of the god Vishnu in Hinduism. He was the charioteer, driving the chariot of the great prince Arjuna into this battle we talked about, which was at once a historical, actual physical battle, but also a spiritual battle. And Krishna says to Arjuna, shake off your cowardice. You need to get in there and actually fight for the truth. So also in a book of saints, now our second religion, Buddhism, Soko Roshi, the Zen Buddhist master, in the piece that you read in a book of saints, in a section called The Meaning of Courage. You might want to go back to that section beginning on page 65 in a book of saints. I'm looking at it myself here right now, and this man, the Soko Roshi, the Rosho Soko Morinaga, says, and I quote, to take the unsettled self in hand under whatever conditions, and return to the mind with which one set out, to pick oneself up again after the mind may change or weaken and break down, to stiffen one's determination, to carry through the oft reconstructed original vow. Isn't that the true meaning of courage? Well, that's also an expression, you see, of standing up for the truth, one's ultimate convictions, regardless of what may happen, what may come, and how much discomfort it may cause you. We talked about the Muslim jihad, the greater jihad being the spiritual war that we all have to fight on the inside of ourselves against our own lower nature, right? The lesser jihad meaning physical defense of the religious community in case someone tries to attack it or exterminate it. And then lastly, most recently, the ordeals of the vision quest that a Native American might undergo. We talked about the extremes of fasting and even sacrifice that go into that. Well, all of these I see as different expressions of these religions saying something stands fixed for all time, and we have to live up to that even though it may hurt sometimes. And I quote here again, Christ, I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. This means that Hindus, traditionalist Hindus and Buddhists and Confucians and Taoists, etc., have another common opponent in relativists. Relativists are people who say it's all relative. There are no absolutes. There's no absolute truth. Things are constantly shifting from culture to culture, from time to time, from person to person. You might also say the opponent are contextualists, who say, again, everything is dependent on context or circumstance or situation. There's no ultimate truth, again, that would spread across all times and all peoples and so on. Well, these religious people, traditionalist, serious, faithful people in the different religions we've looked at, would say, no, you're missing the boat here. There is something that stands true for all time. And then finally, consecration of life brings people, traditionalist people in different religions together, it seems to me. Their sense that all life, every day of our lives, every year of our lives, ought to be in some way dedicated to something higher, a higher purpose, if you will. We see this in Islam, in the faithful Muslims' attempt to follow Muhammad's sunnah. Muhammad's way of acting becomes for all faithful Muslims a pattern or a template for how they should also act in their daily life. We talked about the Hindu ashramas, the different stages of life that a person goes through. Childhood, and then the stage of the householder, the stage of the sannyasi who goes out into the wilderness or into the forest and then comes back to society also. These different stages are ways of consecrating different phases of life and dedicating them to a high spiritual purpose. In East Asia, in Confucianism, it was the practice of li. And remember, li has a sense of both horizontal comportment and etiquette, but also a vertical sense of ritual, so that when we're acting rightly with respect to each other, we're actually tapping into something transcendent in character. And then primal religions, sacrality, I've called it. No division between sacred and profane. Everything you do, how you get up, how you dress, how you act, how you work, how you relate to people, all of that's sacred. Here, to provide a Christian sort of foundation or context for this idea, I quote from St. Paul, "Whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, pure, lovely, gracious, if there is any excellence, anything worthy of praise, think about these things. What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me," Paul says, "do, and the God of peace will be with you." So Paul is basically saying to his followers, the Christians that he's converted to Christianity, you should act toward me as the Muslim acts toward Muhammad. Pattern yourself after my way of living, which is to honor the true, the just, the pure, the lovely, the gracious, and so on, and to consecrate your whole life in that way. From that point of view, traditionalist people across all these boundaries again have a kind of opponent, a common opponent, in cynics. The cynic says basically, right, well, everybody is in this for the ego. There's always power, there's always money. Nobody really has any pure motives at all. We're all jaded. We're all out for number one and so forth. Well, no. The religious people would say no. Yeah, we've got problems. We're sinners, the Christian would say. We're disequilibrated, the Taoists might say. But it's possible to be transformed and to change and to become pure of heart. And we should be aspiring to do that. Another common opponent is the nihilist, who says nothing really has any meaning. There's no meaning at all. Well, again, the religions we've talked about consecrate their lives in a way that say, no, 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 no. There is meaning. There is purpose. There is an ultimate goal to be reached. So this is what I mean about concord and alliance. And this is one of the reasons, again, that I find the perennialist perspective, for myself, you believe whatever you want to, but why I find it beneficial and useful in that it allows for commonality and unity, not necessarily dogmatically in terms of doctrine and practice in this world, where we do see the differences again, but certainly ultimately, transcendently. Well, that's my summary. That's at least what has stood out for me as I try to look back in my own, what did I call it, rear view mirror at the Course. I hope taking a look back at these patterns and highlights will be of some use to you. And, use not just in getting ready for the final exam, that's important, but I hope it'll be of use to you too in your own future life. And if you'll allow me to add, in the future life. Whatever you may believe about that, however you may choose to understand what may happen to you in your own personal journey. Just keep in mind, please, there's a huge difference between listening to a lecture like this or a series of lectures like this and, well, I'll just call it, I guess, the real thing. Be careful to choose wisely when getting in line. I recommend never just follow the crowd.